We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Rachel Cohen. She is a lawyer who technically is on the payroll for a couple more days, as my understanding, at Skadden Arps, which is a one of the biggest law firms in the country. Just give it for folks who don't know that world. Tell us about that firm, how big it is, where it fits in sort of like the legal world.
Anyone who's not familiar with that world, I am a bit jealous and wish that we could all remain unfamiliar, but unfortunately no longer the case. Scadden is one of, like you said, the largest law firms actually in the world. So we have a presence there's offices in Asia, in Europe, and I believe our revenues were upwards of several $billion with a B last year. The partners have a profit per partner that is in the seven figures, and there's a lot of kind of prestige chasing in the legal industry broadly. To the extent people care about for their employers, Scadden is very much on that list. There have been a couple of books that I've read actually where they were aimed at kind of legal audiences, and the way that they shorthand characterized a bit character as someone who was well-connected, but also maybe a little bit of a, I don't know if I can say douchebag on your show because I haven't watched it that much, was that they would say that they worked at Skadden Arps. So I'll be toning for that for some time.
That's good context.
How many, when we say the biggest law firm in the world, tell people how many lawyers work there? How many partners are there?
It's not necessarily one of the biggest law firms in the world, but it is one of the most profitable. I would say it has like some of the widest reach. And so I believe our partnership is only about 1,000 people. I can look it up right now. But it has much more to do with the level of profits that people have and the level of access that you have. There's a reason that our executive partner, Jeremy London, was speaking with Donald Trump directly about kind of the attack on law firms that has been launched by the Trump administration over the last several weeks. These law firms, Skadden, Paul Weiss, if people are familiar, are these firms that have made major deals with the Trump administration, including promising millions of dollars worth of pro bono work to the Trump administration.
I want to get to that because that to me is the one that really sort of resonates here. But so it starts with Paul Weiss, and ostensibly this is about Donald Trump taking vengeance against these firms that have had in the past a lot of Democratic clients. They're sort of like loosely associated with Democratic politics.
And I think Paul Weiss's partner was involved in the Stormy Daniels prosecution, the hush money case that had, was.
And all these firms, there is somebody who either worked maybe in the context of the Mueller investigation or in other investigations against Donald Trump. So ostensibly, it's about revenge. Give me your sense of, well, before we get to that, tell us what it is exactly. When they went to Paul Weiss, when they went to Skadden Arps, and we should say there are other firms that have done something very different, and we'll get to those in a moment. But what is it? How does a government? How does the federal government go and say we're going to attack or punish you? Like what are they threatening them with?
The government is targeting a variety of corporate law firms, and there's firms that are fighting back. There's firms that aren't, as you mentioned, targeting a variety of corporate law firms by threatening to cancel government contracts or also use the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC's enforcement mechanisms to not only remove government contracts and security clearances from firms that they claim are engaging in quote unquote illegal DEI. My For 2 more days, boss used that term in an email sent firm-wide, which imagine being an attorney of color working 60, 70-hour weeks, constantly doing outstanding work and getting an email from your boss about how they wanted to listen to the Trump administration to stamp out the illegal DEI that is happening at Skadden Arps.
Imagine just being a lawyer and reading the words illegal DEI and saying, wait a second, a lawyer's writing this to
Jeremy, spell it out. It's diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And accessibility, actually, we should say, at least in the government context. But I mean, so what can they materially do? They can cancel government contracts that cost them money directly as a first order thing. They can also, I read, inhibit their ability to go into federal buildings, which I don't know how you can't obviously like go to federal court
right.
and litigate in that instance.
And I do think, even to your point of like what they can do, I think that that's still very much being figured out. And that's why people are challenging these, because there's a lot of people, he's using these EEOC enforcement mechanisms through a certain extent. And my firm actually hadn't even been targeted by an executive order. They just received an EEOC demand letter, which, for the record, the deal they cut with Trump does not even include them dropping the EEOC demand letter or potential investigation. But they're using this kind of EEOC mechanism that a lot of former EEOC commissioners are saying is just patently illegal. They're using it wrong. And so even what they quote unquote can do, I think, is up for debate. But what they are doing.
We're talking about what they're threatening with, because we really don't know what they can do yet until it's resolved in a court of law. And you can't know what they can do until you stand up to them. And your soon-to-be former firm refused to do that. So, and we should say that it also sounds like, because I'm reading this story about Coie, I guess it is. Is that the name of the
Perkins Coie?
Perkins Coie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us their story, because this is sort of like the alternate universe. They decide, and frankly, the idea of a bunch of lawyers capitulating so quickly runs contrary to everything that I know of lawyers.
It's also a very bad deal. Even if you say these people aren't litigators, they're corporate, whatever. They went to the White House, didn't even have an executive order lodged against them, didn't get the EEOC demand letter, which requested personal information of my firm and also 19 other firms that was targeted at intimidating diverse employees, asking for name and email address and phone number and all of this stuff. They didn't even get that dropped, and they promised $100 million worth of pro bono hours to the Trump administration, which is more than twice Paul Weiss's $40 million that they promised that was a terrible deal anyway. But to jump back, and I have all of my little executive orders printed here, because this is such an esoteric and inaccessible part of the legal industry, which is already inaccessible deliberately for many people. And so even leading with kind of the way that these firms are being targeted, the executive order that was lodged against Perkins Coie. Before I came on, I heard y'all talking about these deportations and kind of the Stephen Miller of it all. And I think that it's important to name that the attacks on these corporate law firms, who are not very sympathetic victims, and I do not argue with anyone that they are, the attacks here are to intimidate corporate law firms out of providing certain forms of representation. Right. And they do a lot of asylum representation. They do a lot of kind of impact litigation because they're very well resourced. And so the Perkins Coie executive order was launched explicitly naming that it was meant to be retribution, because Perkins Coie had an attorney that used to work there named Mark Elias, who has since left and started his own firm that Trump really, really hates. And so we have this. But my friends and I started organizing in that moment because we read it, and it was clear in the executive order that the Trump administration was going to come after additional firms. And also in a public service loan forgiveness executive order, which came out the next day, he listed all of these different things that he didn't think should qualify for public service loan forgiveness anymore. And it includes things like aiding and abetting violations of federal immigration laws. And we know what that means in Trump speak. It includes things like supporting terrorism. We know what that means in Trump speak. Child abuse, including the chemical and surgical castration or mutilation of children, or the trafficking of children to so-called transgender sanctuary states. He's outlining what kind of work he does not want attorneys to be doing. And he followed it up, I believe, weekend before last, March 21st, it posted on the 22nd, with directions to the Attorney General to sanction attorneys that are engaged in this kind of representation.
And they can go back 8 years to assess whether these attorneys have been filing frivolous actions against the government simply based upon whether they lost. Yep. And so, of course.
If Trump was to apply that standard to himself, I'm not necessarily sure he would be able to do so with the level of frivolity. I mean, but his frivolous lawsuits were getting rewarded with this anticipatory obedience by what? It was the other media organizations that gave in, but the law firms too.
Yep,
So,
and it is anticipatory, and it's also all projection, right? But I'm sorry, Sam, please.
well, no. But I mean, I think the point you're making here is that this is all, any reason why they went after these firms was a pretense to basically say, you do not bring cases against us for immigration or any of our policy objectives that we want. And if you do, because Perkins Coie, they lost one or two clients. Apparently other clients were like, we appreciate what you're doing. But that's what this is about, right? I mean, it's about these law firms worrying that they're going to lose access, worrying that they're going to make targets out of their clients. Right? Like, I mean, if Skadden Arps is like representing, I don't know, pick a client, the federal government could be coming after these clients just because of their association with Skadden Arps. I mean, that is that's the fear here.
It is the fear, but it's also so ridiculous because it seems like all of these very smart people should understand. And I did work with them, and I do think that they're very smart, no matter how determined they are to prove me wrong over the last couple of days. But we have all of these very smart people, and surely you have to understand that you are not going to win by giving into a bully like the Trump administration. And I think it's this kind of like historical condescension where we're convinced that we can sit around and say, well, Neville Chamberlain, what a fool, when he was just giving into the German demands. But do we think it was more obvious at that time? Or do we think that we just, for some reason, believe that we're smarter than all of these people that are not that much older than us, are still human beings that are smarter than us? It's not as clear as people think it is. And people are acting like it's still 2016. They're determined to prove that they're smarter than Donald Trump is. And whether that's true or not, right now, it doesn't appear to be, because you are getting outplayed.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, I think it's very scary. I think, once they come for the lawyers, once they basically say to the lawyers, you can't represent a certain various groups in our society, and the lawyers say, okay, then it's just the floodgates are open. Because right now, as it stands, there's, I mentioned this yesterday on the program, there's about 2 or 3 things that are basically slowing the roll of the Trump administration. One is any type of political pressure, and we see that with the elections that are taking place today, because that undermines the confidence maybe of some lawmakers, but there's only so much that's going to do. And the other is organizing amongst people, broadly speaking, labor, whatnot. But at this very moment, the one thing that is slowing the roll is like the 80 some odd, maybe now 90 cases that have been brought against the Trump administration in various forms that are slowing their roll. Now, here's the other thing about you brought up the pro bono stuff. The Trump administration now, like I say, is dealing with all of these lawsuits, whether they're from the ACLU, whether they're from the Brennan Center, whether they're from Perkins Coie, all across the board. They don't have the resources to deal with all of these cases that are coming in. The DOJ, if anything, they have less resources than they had 6 months ago, because they're firing all these prosecutors. They're firing all these DOJ people. They're installing political appointees. Not always the brightest bulbs, frankly.
Not at all. And I don't think that you can be a good attorney and work for the Trump administration, because it requires you to kind of bend and disregard the law in so many different ways, and the system itself in so many different ways, that even if you are smart, you're probably not a very good attorney if you're working for that administration in this moment.
I think that's absolutely the case. We saw that just with the federal prosecutors in the Southern District who had to resign because they're just like, none of this makes sense.
Yep.
Where is that pro bono work going? That's what I want to know, because it seems to me that we could have, instead of, and this is aside from the fact that these are firms that were already doing pro bono work. They have a limited amount. I mean, I know this too. Like, they don't expand. This isn't an extra $100 million worth of pro bono work they're doing. They're going to be not doing other pro bono work to do this pro bono work. So there's an opportunity cost that's associated with it. But where are they deploying? Where are they deploying these resources? Because we could have a situation where Skadden Arps attorneys are fighting to deport people.
And it may just really quickly make sense to describe what pro bono work is more broadly for the audience and these corporate law firms' relationship with it too, what it traditionally is and what the administration may be wanting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma, because I think that it's a super crucial piece of the puzzle here. So it's tough because you don't want to come on to any type of outward-facing media and act like corporate law firms that often charge upwards of $3,000 an hour for top partners, that they're on the front lines of justice work. We know that they are not. And we know the people that are doing that work are historically extremely underfunded because of the nature of American capitalism. And so we have these law firms that kind of say to people that are coming out of law school and really want the high paycheck that, okay, we know that a lot of our clients, a lot of the representations that you'll be doing are just very, very well resourced and maybe not exactly in the pursuit of justice, though they are in the pursuit of an adversarial legal system, which I think goes back to Sam's point around we need lawyers to bring cases because we don't have like a sua sponte legal system where stuff just goes to the courts when it's unconstitutional. You have to have lawyers to bring those cases. And that ties into the kind of pro bono work, because what law firms will do to kind of entice people to do some reputation management. And also, I really thought because they believed in it, though it's certainly not appearing that way, as those values are kind of put to the test against losing a modicum of profit, we have corporate law firms that will partner with a variety of the organizations that you just listed, ACLU, Brennan Center, et cetera, or even kind of more local organizations. And firms will allow their associates to do that pro bono work and count a certain number of hours or unlimited number of hours. Last year, I think I did over 350 hours of pro bono work towards my bonus requirement. They'll allow them to count it towards their bonus. And so you get people who kind of, it's viewed as mutually beneficial, it's you're training up, you get more responsibility, you also get to work on things that you care about. And so if we have large corporate law firms that are the best resourced and often ally with these organizations because they have just enormous amounts of staffing, though I did overstate and looked it up, and I think we only have like 350 partners at Scadden, which is crazy because, like I said, the revenue per year is in the billions with a B. But we have these people who are very well resourced who can kind of throw their weight and training behind these causes because otherwise they just don't have enough attorneys. And that's not because like, thank God for big law. That's just the reality of the system in which we live and where resources have been allocated. And so I'm not arguing that that's normatively good, but it is really necessary within the legal system as currently existing. And so you have people that are being intimidated out of doing certain kinds of pro bono work. And you have all of these firm leaders saying, no, we're still committed to pro bono. But 2 weeks ago, they were saying the exact same thing about DEI. They won't put any of it in writing. And you have the government taking these firms, asking them to do millions of dollars worth of work for them, while also issuing the kinds of executive orders and guidance and fact sheets, quote unquote fact sheets. We're using that as in the way that the administration uses it. We have them putting out these things directing public interest attorneys to be punished, being stripped of their public student or their public service loan forgiveness if they work at certain organizations. So it's a multi-tiered attack. He's also attacking judges, but I think it's actually quite smart that he went to these large corporate law firms first, because it was a huge gamble. If they'd all united and stood up to him, it would have really undercut this all-out assault on the legal system. But the first time I read one of the executive orders, I said to myself, he has somebody inside doing this work who has worked at one of these places before, because he is betting on their kind of capitalistic cowardice to keep them from standing up for what's right. And I think that people's heads are so in the sand. They're so convinced that it's 2016 all over again, even though in 2016 they actually did stand up to the Trump administration. But they've been laying the groundwork for this for a very long time. The right is good at that. I have a case here that was, the opinion came out on March 14th, 2025. It's called RNC v. Justin Wetzel. It was a voting rights case. There's this judge on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Texas named James Ho. You may be familiar. We should just
remind people the Fifth Circuit there's essentially really a couple of judges down there that the right will venue shop. They will go down to the Fifth Circuit. They know there's a couple of venues within the Fifth Circuit, which is down in Texas, one of the states, where when they basically go into the lottery for judges, there's only like 2 judges there, and they know who they're getting. And there was an attempt by the federal judicial, essentially association, to change that mechanism they had been using to venue shop, and they got so much pushback that they basically walked away from it. And so we're left with this. But that's why every time we hear one of these rulings, they'll come out of the Fifth Circuit.
Very much so. And so James Ho files the concurrence. He agrees in the judgment, no need to write an opinion. And he writes a concurrence that's 2 pages about how pro bono at corporate law firms has been biased for so long. There's another explanation. The pro bono activity in this case may just reflect the institutional bias at many of the nation's largest law firms. And then he cites some articles that are published in journals that are extremely right-leaning. We have the Federalist Society, which is a right-leaning organization on law school campuses that was founded decades ago, that put out their own journals so that people can write extremely biased things and then cite to it. It's kind of the legal journal of Fox News, and cites to things about pro bono institutional bias as if the reason that pro bono tilts towards people who do not have resources is because those firms are biased and not because that's who needs free legal work. And so this is a really just across the board, intentional, well planned out. It's brilliant, even though I think that it is normatively evil plan to undercut all of these things. And then you have big law attorneys who are convinced that they're smarter than the Trump administration and they can outmaneuver him.
Do you think that they're convinced that they're smarter than him and they're outmaneuvering him and they're going to be sly about this? Or do you think it's like, at the end of the day, they're just like, well, let's make this less friction. Let's just make this more frictionless, and it doesn't matter to us.
I wish that it was the latter, because I would understand that more. But I worked with these people for years. I worked with them for years. They genuinely just think that they are smarter than he is. And it's extremely troubling. And listen, I grew up in Ohio. I went to Ohio State, and then I went to Harvard Law School. And it's something that I've seen play out over and over again. I hate to invoke the coastal elitism of it all, because I think that veers into anti-intellectualism sometimes. And that's not it. We want people to read, to understand, to engage with the world. And it's not bad to do those things. But to assume that your educational credentials mean that you are smarter than someone who is a Republican because they grew up in, a different place than you are, and that's what we see a lot of the time. There's this belief in many of these white shoe corporate law firms and in many of these liberal spaces broadly with people with strong educational credentials that the reason that these decisions are being made is just because the people making them are stupid. And that is so fundamentally incorrect. They are outplaying us. And there are people that need to be educated and engaged with 100%, but they are not Stephen Miller. They are not sitting in the White House making these decisions right now. And that's the way that law firm leaders are treating it. My understanding is that the line on the ground at Scadden right now to associates is that Scadden got a great deal because they didn't really promise him anything at all. They just promised $100 million in pro bono work, and they get to decide what the pro bono work is. And the second anyone pushes on it, the partners that are saying it don't have answers for them, but have drunk the Kool-Aid of their own intellectual superiority so deeply that it's going to be too late before they figure out that they don't
understand that. I mean, frankly, Donald Trump, at the end of the day, if he doesn't get that $100 million worth of pro bono work, he still got what he wanted, which was to show that he could intimidate a firm like this. So if you're a smaller firm or you're an immigration attorney, you got your own, you're doing it on your own, and you're going against the government in an immigration proceedings. You're terrified right now. You're terrified.
And that's the thing that I'm so glad that you brought that back up, because it's so important that we bring back around. It's not about kind of the comeuppance of the corporate law firms. It is about the people legally in this country who are getting deported or indefinitely detained over free speech rights, or who are just due process rights violated right and left. And that is the ultimate end game here. It's not about the law firms. And that's why I quit. right? Like, it's not about, oh no, my firm might get embarrassed. It's people are going to die, and they probably already have.
And in terms of it rings very true to me what you're saying. Just the idea that they think they're smarter than they think this is Sidney Powell or something like this all over again, as opposed to a very well coordinated, pre-planned lawfare legal assault, essentially from the attorney general who's going to do whatever Trump wants. It's frankly the problem with the Democratic Party, where they think their views should be self-evident as opposed to being, and the virtue of their views being smarter is self-evident as opposed to making their case to the public. But that's a bit of an aside. Do you have a sense of what they want the pro bono work to be reoriented towards? Like, is this about cracking down on anti-Semitism, aka kids on college campus exercising their free speech rights? Because that's what it smells like to me, at the very least.
I am quite confident that that's one of the directions that it will be going in. And I think there's so much rhetoric that the Democratic Party and maybe those that criticize the critics is the word I was looking for. I also am not really my own intellect in this moment. Critics are leaning into is rhetoric that's really harmful here, right? Like focusing on the fact that some of the people that are being deported had no criminal history. That we care about everyone's due process rights. Like, we don't want to lean into some of this is okay. It's okay for some people to not have due process rights and not others. The notion of Pam Bondi is like Barbie Bondi, this playing into her as a moron, when there's this clearly targeted attack. And then very much what you said, the branding around this task force to combat anti-Semitism is incredibly deliberate. My name is Rachel Cohen. I don't practice, but I've had an internet presence for some period of time. And I'm well aware that anti-Semitism exists. And so to position, though, the notion that the biggest threat to any minority in this country is an op-ed written against dropping bombs on children, and not an authoritarian government that is picking and choosing due process and free speech rights. If they win that kind of marketing battle, and they're very close to it, we are in far deeper trouble than anyone has identified outside of a few spaces like this one.
Tell me just like your perspective on, I mean, you've worked with the folks at that firm, you went through law school, you probably have a sense of what the people at Paul Weiss are like, you may know some. Are you surprised that you're the only attorney to quit?
I'm not the only attorney. Two other people at Skadden have already quit since they announced their deal.
Is that right? Okay.
Several others I know have quit who were not willing to kind of, I don't think that they will do media in the same way. Some of them might, but I think that people at Skadden are organizing around refusing to recruit. They are holding, my understanding is that someone quit yesterday at the end of a town hall meeting, and the rest of the group stood up and applauded him as he walked out. So I will say this, I don't know where the Paul Weiss people are, because I'm not familiar of any of them quitting. But I will say none of this is to apologize for the big law industry. None of it is to say that the Scadden reputation and characterization isn't a little bit warranted. But I stayed at that firm for as long as I did because the people that I worked alongside believed in pro bono the same way that I did, believed in the justice system the same way that I did, even if we recognized that we were in this kind of very, very profit-centric space. And I think that we will probably see other people quit, but even if we don't, I think that you're going to see really powerful organizing. It's just a risk-averse industry, and a lot of people, it's been an incredible opportunity to get to do this kind of media. It's also unbelievably overwhelming, and I do not fault anyone who doesn't want to do it.
And can you, when you, we appreciate you coming on, your thought there sparked a question for me. Is there a really noticeable split between the associates, you're a third-year associate, and the partners at the firm? And if you could explain how the partners have this a much more direct financial stake in, the clients, and how they're more likely to, obviously cave on this front.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for opening, because I think that's important to understand as well. So Scadden is an equity partnership only structure. Most of these law firms have an equity partner and then like a junior or income partner tier. And if you're equity partner only, all of the profits that go in, and you might get a little bit of additional profits if you're the person that brought the client in, for example, but ultimately you're profit splitting with the rest of the partnership. And so I've gotten the question a lot if this is a generational divide. I don't think that it is. And I think that played, and that's not what you asked, to be fair. I'm voicing that because I'm sure there's people that are watching that are wondering the same thing.
But it overlaps. It overlaps.
Yeah. It does. And you're a little older if you're a partner, obviously. And I think that the way this all kind of ties into the kind of anti-intellectual, like the notion that young generations just get it and older generations just don't, I think is one that's really harmful. And there's so many lovingly referred to as old heads, right, that we can learn so much from. They just don't stay in the industry long enough to make partner, even if they go into big law for a couple of years, as I did, to build up some financial stability, get trained up, I really wanted to understand the private sector. I understand that came with a lot of financial benefit to me and working for clients that I didn't always agree with. And so I make no apologies for that, because there are no apologies to be made. I also did learn a lot. And so people stay and they make partner. And if they've self-selected, they probably are a little bit more of a believer in institutions than I would personally identify. But I think that many of them understand just how out of left field this is. I think many of them understand that Donald Trump has authoritarian tendencies. And what I find fascinating is that they seem to think that someone else will fix it. And that's one of the things that I experienced it at Harvard all the time, is you'd go in and people would say, can't believe no one's doing anything about this. And I'd be like, your dad's a senator. What are you talking about? And so one of the reasons that I've decided to be so public on this, and something that I think is so important for people to remember, I have an unbelievable amount of privilege. I am also just one person backed by a lot of other people. And I hope that it is encouraging to see what can happen when you are organized with people that you really believe in, and one person is willing to speak about something that is happening. Because whether we win or not, I know that if no one had spoken on this, the story would have died quite quickly. Because you have to have someone that's able to go and explain it and talk about it and all of these things. And it's such an important story, and it's such a difficult one to understand if you're not in the industry. It's so possible for a couple of us to do the right thing and have it mean something. And so if you're questioning and you're feeling so overwhelmed, this wasn't just me standing alone, right? This is friends whose values, it was a big values test to be in this industry following October 7th. And to be in kind of a high profile client facing industry as conversations were ongoing about not just US military policy, but also the rising transphobia of the Democratic Party and the willingness to sell people out. Those things are pressure tests. And once you know that you can trust people and organize with them, you've got your group. I hate to say it, because I also, just like those partners, keep waiting for someone else to do this stuff. But at a certain point, if no one's doing it, you have to do it. You have to. Someone has to.
Yeah.
Rachel Cohen, thank you so much for your time today. Very much looking forward to what you do next. Keep us in the loop. Really appreciate both your coming on and telling us about it, and every step you're taking, and all those folks who have left that firm in solidarity, and those who are staying and trying to figure out a way of, undermining some of this stuff from within. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to explain.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.